The sun had not yet risen over the limestone ridges when Thomas of Sighs stirred from his mat. The air inside his narrow clay house still held the cool hush of night, though dust had already begun to settle on the sandals by the door. The Nile, somewhere beyond the line of clustered palm trees, whispered promises of light and labor. Thomas sat up and rubbed his eyes. The scent of baked grain lingered from last night's supper. Beside him, Miriam shifted in her sleep, her arm protectively curled around their son, Jonah. The boy's breath came steady, though tinged with a faint rasp that worried her more than she ever admitted aloud. Outside, the world belonged to laborers, and Thomas was one of them. A painter, not of the kind who painted for pleasure, but one trained in the strict codes of temple murals. Every brushstroke a command, every figure a law. He was known for his discipline and silence, and though no one spoke it, they all trusted him with the faces of gods and kings. He didn't believe in all the gods, not in the way the priest did, but he did believe in the work. He left before dawn like he always did. The village of artisans men like him was quiet as he walked. He passed the stonemason Saul, sharpening his chisel, the older man nodding silently in recognition. Further along Levy, the scribe was seated under a faded awning, already dipping his reed pen into black ink and muttering dates under his breath. They were a community shaped by skill, bounded by order, and controlled by a temple bureaucracy that never slept. Behind every task lay a ledger, behind every mistake a punishment. The gatekeeper at the eastern gate of the necropolis raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Thomas had never been late. He walked past the jackal-headed statue with averted eyes and entered the work site, a half-finished temple being raised in honor of a long-dead ruler whose name was barely remembered but whose tomb must never be forgotten. Inside, the foreman clapped his hands and barked assignments. Thomas North Wall, restoration of battle scene, keep the chariot proportions aligned, and don't change the expressions. Thomas nodded and moved to the scaffold, where two younger assistants awaited with pots of ochre lapis and hematite. The battle scene was faded, and decades of sand had worn the shields down to halos. His job was not to invent, but to remember, to interpret fragments with care. He dipped the brush into red ochre and studied the face of a soldier. Half erased the lines suggested weariness rather than glory. "You're painting him too old," one of the assistants remarked. "He was old," Thomas said quietly. "You knew him, no. But no soldier looks like a boy by the time he's reached this wall." The assistant shrugged and turned away. Thomas continued. He had no interest in arguing. Hours passed. He climbed. Sweat darkened his tunic and blurred his vision, but he did not stop. The wall was his oath. With each figure restored, each spear aligned, he told a story no one would remember unless he told it right. At midday, a servant brought dates and water. He ate in the shade with the others, stonecutters, plasterers, even a junior priest who looked far too clean for the worksite. "Heard they're cutting 3 workers this week," the plasterer said. "Budget?" someone asked. "No. One of them lied on his name seal. Said he was from Thebes, but he's from Akhmim." That was all it took. A wrong name. Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth. In a place where the gods were painted taller than kings, a man's truth was smaller than ink. That afternoon, the overseer approached. He was a lean man with a scroll tucked under his arm and ink stains on his fingers. "Thomas." "Yes, sir. Your next assignment is a private commission. House of Meritev, nobleman. He wants his father painted into a shrine wall." Thomas raised an eyebrow. His father was not a priest. "I know. He wants legacy." The implication hung in the air. Bribery, ambition, historical revision. "Will the work be signed?" "No." "Then I'll do it." The overseer smiled faintly. "You always do." Thomas said nothing. He returned to the scaffold and resumed his strokes, but his thoughts had shifted. There were rules to this life, but those who paid could bend them. When he returned home at dusk, Jonah was running a slight fever. Miriam sat by the low table, grinding herbs, her brow tight. "Did you ask the priest for medicine?" he asked. "I did. They said we're not temple kin." He exhaled slowly and reached into his tunic. From a hidden pouch, he pulled 2 copper daben, the bribe from Meritef. "It's not temple medicine, but it'll buy time." Miriam didn't smile, but she nodded, and that was enough. That night, Thomas sat outside their home, watching the stars shimmer above the flat rooftops. He didn't believe the stars held answers, but he believed in remembering especially those who didn't make it to the walls. He dipped his worn brush into water and traced a silent face onto an old scrap of limestone. Not for a king, not for a god, but for the boy Jonah, who might grow old enough to understand that legacy wasn't painted in gold, but in the hands that made space for others. The commission came faster than expected. By the second morning after the overseer's quiet word, a messenger arrived at Thomas's door, young, thin, and dressed in a linen tunic far cleaner than anyone in the artisan village ever wore. "Sir," the boy said, bowing slightly, "Meritef's house awaits you at midday. You are to bring your tools." Thomas nodded. No room for questions. The boy left without even waiting for water. Miriam was kneading barley dough by the hearth, eyes flickering toward their sleeping son. "You'll go?" she asked without looking up. "I have to. They say he bought his position." They all did. She didn't argue. Meritef's estate stood on the edge of Thebes proper, far enough from the artisan quarters to feel like another world. The front gate bore the family sigil, a falcon above a plough. Aspiration and inheritance woven into one symbol. Thomas was led through a shaded garden, where date palms leaned over narrow canals. Slaves moved silently, heads bowed. A scent of crushed papyrus and fish oil clung to the air. Wealth had a way of making every odor seem intentional. The nobleman himself met him in the atrium. Meritef was young, perhaps no older than 30, with a narrow face, manicured beard, and a gaze trained in the art of expectation. "You're the painter," he said without greeting. "Yes, I've seen your work in the northern temple wall. You restore silence well." Thomas inclined his head. "I paint what remains," good Meritef said, "because I need you to paint what never was." The shrine was small, elegant, and unfinished, a limestone alcove tucked behind the house's second courtyard. Its arch curved perfectly, but the wall it framed was blank. "That is where my father must stand," Meritef said, "among the offering priests." Thomas ran his fingers along the stone. "You want him painted into a ritual scene?" "Yes, with correct iconography. He must be seen as a man of divine knowledge, holding the young, blessing the grain. Was he ever a priest? No. He was a trader of incense, but he built this house. Without him, I would be dust." Thomas looked again at the empty wall. "You want me to rewrite his place in history. I want you to honor him as I see him." Thomas did not argue, not then. He asked for the family seal, the father's name, and the preferred style of depiction, upper kingdom or composite. Meritef chose the more ancient style, stiff, formal, unmistakably pious. "And the face?" Thomas asked. "Do you have a likeness?" The nobleman pointed toward a small funerary mask near the altar, its gold leaf cracking slightly at the edges. "That will do," Meritef said. Thomas returned home with a sack of fresh pigments and a sealed order from the estate. On his walk back through the artisan village, Levi the scribe approached him with a knowing look. "I hear you're painting the incense baron into the heavens," he said. "I'm painting what was paid for?" Levi smirked. "Aren't we all?" But the words sat poorly with Thomas. That night, as Jonah slept beside the flickering oil lamp, Thomas studied the mask Meritef had loaned him. It was crude, the eyes too large, the cheekbones exaggerated. Not a real likeness, but a dream of one. Miriam sat beside him, wrapping Jonah's cough tincture in cloth. "He wants the man remembered," she said, "but not truthfully. Truth doesn't feed children," she murmured. He said nothing. The silence agreed with her. The work began the next day. Unlike temple murals, which were guided by strict symbolic registers, private commissions allowed for subtle liberties. Thomas could shade more deeply, draw lines with softer curves, even add a faint crease beside the eye to suggest years. But what haunted him wasn't the technique, it was the lie. Every stroke of the ankh in the man's hand, every line of painted prayer beside him rewrote the record. The man had never served the gods. He had traded with foreign ships and once evaded taxes by bribing 2 junior scribes. And yet, here he was ascending. During a midday break, Thomas sat outside the estate's workshop. Another painter named Caleb joined him, an older man who had once taught Thomas as an apprentice. "I've done 4 shrines this year," Caleb said, sipping water. "All for men who never prayed a day in their lives. Do you ever say no to what their money to their request?" Caleb smiled grimly. "I said no once. The priest overseeing the tomb warned me I'd never paint again. I had a daughter to marry off, so I painted." Thomas stared into the dust. "Do you ever feel it changes you?" "No," Caleb said, wiping his hands, "but it changes them." By the 3rd week, the shrine was nearly complete. The incense trader stood beside 2 robed priests, his painted face glowing with authority. Offerings of lotus and grain lay at his feet. Behind him, a painted scroll bore fake titles, "He who is blessed by Ra, protector of ship's son of the temple." It made Thomas sick. On the final morning, Meritef visited the alcove. "It's perfect," he said softly. "You've made him immortal." Thomas said nothing. Meritef turned to him. "You know, one day I'll be on this wall too. And when that day comes, I'll need you again." Thomas looked at him. "I may not be painting anymore." Oh, Meritef smirked. "What will you do?" Thomas hesitated. "Remember," he said. That night, he returned home late. Miriam was sitting on the threshold, eyes strained. "Jonah," he asked. "He's better." The tincture helped. He sat beside her and took her hand. The night was hot. Stars flickered without poetry. "I finished it," he said. "The shrine." "Yes." "Did you paint the lie?" "Yes." She was quiet. "But I added something," he said. Miriam looked at him. A crack in the corner. Faint, almost invisible, like the stone shifted before drying. "Why?" "So one day someone might wonder." She touched his face. "You're not like them. I don't want to be." They went inside. Outside, the wind stirred dust across the old roads. Somewhere across the city, a nobleman lit incense to honor a memory he had paid to create. And in a small home near the edge of the workers' village, a man who painted silence began to sleep. But he did not rest. He was already dreaming of a wall that spoke truth. Setanach walked through the inner corridor of the temple, guided by one of the overseer's assistants. The boy's sandals made soft shuffling sounds on the limestone floor, but Setanach heard none of it. His mind was still tethered to Petros's frail breathing from the night before. The overseer Kay greeted him with a nod at the entrance of the inner sanctum. "You are trusted, Setanach," he said flatly. "This task must be done before the next full moon. The high priest wants no delay." Setanach stepped into the chamber. It wasn't like the grand outer walls adorned with gods and pharaohs riding chariots. This room was solemn, older. The walls bore fragments of earlier dynasties, more modest in style, almost crude. Some carvings had chipped away. Paint had flaked. But beneath it, Setanach recognized something unusual. Not just erosion. Something had been deliberately scraped off. He knelt, fingers tracing the faded pigments. There were outlines of figures, human figures, but not in the stance of worship. They seemed in protest, holding staff, standing in groups. He couldn't be sure. Restore it with the same scenes as the Hall of Offerings Kay instructed, dropping a scroll at Setanach's feet. That is the official record now. Setanach looked up. "You want me to erase this now?" Kay leaned closer, his voice low. "I want you to paint what was always meant to be here." Setanach didn't reply. The boy who had guided him earlier lingered at the entrance, fidgeting. Kay turned on his heel and left. Setanach stared at the wall again. It wasn't cracked because of time. Someone had tried to forget something. That night, he couldn't sleep. Nephra rubbed her eyes as she wrapped a cloth around Petros's chest, murmuring soothing words. Did they give you more pay, she asked, without looking up. No, Setanak replied. He was staring at his inkstone. But they gave me something heavier. Nefra turned. You're not a priest. You paint. Setanak nodded. Yes. But what if I paint a lie? She stood still for a moment. Then do it well enough to feed your family. Setanak couldn't argue. But the wall, it called to something deeper in him. A quiet voice that reminded him of the old artisan who had trained him Amunet, who once told him, we don't paint gods, we paint memory. Over the next 3 days, he worked slowly. He followed the official scroll by day, painted careful replications of ritual sacrifices, offerings to the gods' golden chariots. But he documented the original wall in sketches at home, on scraps of discarded linen tucked between bricks in the corner of his home. By candlelight, he copied the hands of the silent crowd, their missing faces, a sun symbol scratched across a seated man's chest. It wasn't rebellion, it was something else. A moment of history stripped of its title. He wasn't trying to defy, he was trying to remember. On the 6th day, the overseer returned. You're behind, Kay said, glancing at the half-finished mural. It's meticulous work, Setanak replied. I'd rather be slow than dishonor the gods. Kay scoffed. The gods sleep behind gold now. Finish it. He left behind a pouch of copper Daban, more than Setanak earned in a month. That night, Setanak didn't eat. He sat outside under the stars watching the horizon over Thebes. He heard voices in the wind, not spirits, but the murmurs of memory. The weight of a brush in his hand was no longer just about pigment. It was about truth and the cost of burying it. Morning light poured over the rooftops of Thebes, warming the cracked clay of Setanak's courtyard. He hadn't slept. The linen sketch of the original wall lay folded beneath a chipped jug, ink smudged where his tired hands had trembled. Nefra found him sitting in the dust, staring at nothing. You need rest, she said gently. Setanak shook his head. If I sleep, I might forget what I saw. Petros was still weak, but had stopped coughing blood. Nefra had traded a basket of dates for herbal infusions at the marketplace. For the first time in days, the boy's breathing didn't rattle, but the silence in Setanak's chest deepened. He returned to the temple, with a decision forming in the corners of his mind. If they wanted history repainted, so be it. But he would bury something deeper beneath the visible paint, beneath the narrative they forced. He would hide truth in the cracks. By the end of the week, the overseer returned. Faster now, Kay barked. The high priest will be inspecting soon. Setanak only nodded, laying out his paints. But what Kay did not notice was the pattern he had begun etching beneath the top layer, a language only skilled artisans would detect. In the fold of a robe, he placed the face of one of the erased figures. In the curve of a lotus, the symbol of the sun, with a cross drawn not for worship, but remembrance. By day, he painted what was expected. By night, he rewrote what was stolen. He began using diluted pigments beneath the surface inks that would vanish under torchlight but linger in the morning. Old techniques passed down through artisans who understood that not all walls stood forever, but some truths did. One evening, a fellow artisan approached as he was packing up. You paint slower than most, the man said, with a half smile. Better that than wrong, Setanak replied, cautious. The man glanced at the wall, then at Setanak's hand still stained with ochre. I know what you're doing. Setanak stiffened. The courtyard behind the temple was empty, but walls had ears. I was there when they scraped the old mural, the artisan said, voice low. They didn't want the people to see what happens when priests silence the wrong crowd. Setanak looked into his eyes. Then help me remember it. A slow nod. Tomorrow, I'll bring my tools. At home, Petros smiled for the first time in weeks. He held a reed brush imitating his father, dragging it across the dirt with clumsy joy. Nefra watched them with tired but steady eyes. You're painting with fire, she said once Petros had gone to sleep. How long do you think you can hide it? Setena kissed her forehead, long enough for someone to uncover it. That's all I can hope for. Nefra leaned her head on his shoulder. The sound of the Nile at night filtered through the wind, steady and eternal. The next morning, the artisan returned. His name was Meru, older than Setena, with lines deepened by both sun and secrets. Two men worked side by side without words. A flick of a brush, here a shallow scratch of truth there. Their hands moved in rhythm, burying the real story under the guise of reverence. By the time the high priest arrived that week, the walls shone with gold and praise. "Excellent work," the priest declared, eyes approving. "A testament to divine memory." Setanuk bowed, hiding the guilt behind the mask of humility. But under the painted ankhs and sun discs, the real memory waited. Beneath the gilded glory, the ink of truth had already soaked into the stone. The midday sun had little mercy. Inside the temple's inner chamber, the air was thick with incense and sweat. Setanuk worked slowly, carefully, mixing a new shade of blue, grinding lapis into powder until his arms burned. Meru sat beside him, carving a line so faint it was nearly invisible. They barely spoke anymore. Communication had narrowed into glances, nods, and the quiet trust of shared purpose. Over the past 10 days, the mural had taken shape. On the surface, it told the story of divine order Ra, guiding the pharaoh's hand, the gods blessing the city, the high priest smiling among painted papyrus. But underneath, hidden in folds of cloth and shadows of temple columns, were names, faces, gestures of resistance, the quiet records of erased men. It wasn't art anymore. It was testimony. One evening, as they washed their brushes in silence, Meru spoke. They executed 3 scribes last season for keeping older records. Setanuk looked up. From Aket's school, Meru nodded. One of them was my cousin. Hid tablets in a brick wall. They found them anyway. Setanuk's hands paused in the water. "Why do you still help me?" Meru smiled bitterly. "Because it's not about surviving anymore. It's about making it harder for them to erase us next time." Back in the workers' quarter, Petros had begun sketching on shards of pottery. Nefra set a limit only after he helped with firewood. The boy obeyed, but his joy was uncontainable. He showed Setanuk his drawings every night. Boats, birds, men with long arms. "Is this me?" Setanuk asked, once holding up a clumsy stick figure with a wide headdress. Petros nodded solemnly. "You're the man who fixes the wall." Setanuk blinked. Then he smiled and tucked the shard into his satchel. That night, he added a new detail to the mural, a boy in the corner holding a clay shard, eyes wide with wonder. No one would notice, but one day someone might. Then, without warning, came the first crack. Not on the wall, but in their circle. One of the apprentices, Ketu, a boy no older than 20, was caught sketching details from the hidden layers. He wasn't careful. He didn't understand the gravity of secrecy. Kay dragged him into the storage hall. Later, Ketu returned bruised and silent. He never painted again. That night, Setanuk couldn't sleep. He sat in the courtyard, staring at the night sky, remembering how it used to feel to paint simply for beauty. For gods, maybe. For stories. Now every brushstroke carried weight. When Nefra joined him, she didn't ask what troubled him. She brought a cup of water and a scrap of papyrus, with 2 figures, one large, one small. Petros's drawing. "I found this in his bed," she whispered. Setanuk traced the figures. A father, a son, holding hands. "He deserves a world where he doesn't have to paint in whispers," he said. Nefra didn't answer, but she took his hand. The next day, the high priest ordered an inspection. Priest officials, even a foreign envoy, all gathered to see the nearly completed mural. Kay hovered near them, nervous and proud. Setanuk kept his head bowed. Meru stood still beside him. "Well done," the high priest declared. "Truly divine craftsmanship. Even Pharaoh himself would approve." One of the priests nodded toward the lower edge. "What's this figure?" Setanuk's heart stopped. The man pointed at the small boy with the clay shard, the hidden tribute to Petros. Kay stepped forward. "That's a servant child. a symbol of humility before the gods. The priest grunted. Make sure it stays humble. They moved on. Later that night, Meru exhaled sharply beside the fire. You got lucky. Setanuk stared into the flames. Maybe, or maybe the wall protects itself. Meru laughed dryly. Walls don't protect us, my friend. We protect them, until we can't. The festival of Wadjet approached. While the rest of the city prepared garlands and offerings, the temple became a hive of tension. More officials appeared, more patrols. Kay became shorter, with his words sharper with his eyes. But Setanuk noticed something else too, something quieter. People were whispering. Laborers, cooks, even temple guards. Hushed voices, quick glances, as if the wall itself had started to murmur. One night, Meru confirmed it. They know what we're doing, he said. Maybe not everything, but enough. Setanuk looked at him weary. And what will they do? Depends who speaks first. Us or them. Back in the living quarters, Petros had been unusually silent. Nefra noticed it too. He still sketched, but his drawings grew darker. Broken carts cracked jars, lone figures on boats. What's wrong? Setanuk asked. Petros hesitated, then said, There's a man who comes to the temple at night. He watches the wall. Setanuk stiffened. Who I don't know. He wears priest robes but doesn't speak. That night, Setanuk kept watch. As the moon rose high, he saw it a robed figure in the inner chamber standing too still too long. He did not approach. Neither did the figure. The next morning, Kay summoned him. You've done excellent work, the overseer said. The high priest is pleased. Setanuk bowed silently. There will be a final inspection soon, KTG continued. Foreign guests, high-ranking eyes. You'll be dismissed after that until the next commission. Dismissed. The word felt like a door closing. Kay leaned closer. Finish well. Don't disappoint. Setanuk knew what that meant. Don't make the wall speak too loudly. That evening, Setanuk gathered Meru and Nefra. They're watching, he said. After this commission, we're done. Meru folded his arms. Good. I'm tired of hiding. Nefra was less calm. What about the wall? Setanuk exhaled. We'll finish it. But no more additions. Not after today. Meru nodded. Then we carved the names tonight. They waited until the temple dimmed. Then in the far corner of the mural beneath the feet of the priests inside a cluster of painted reeds, they etched. Not big, not visible from afar, but deep. Setanuk carved Amunimet, the old stonemason. Meru added Satim, his cousin. Nefra included her mother's name. And Petros, though told to sleep, had scrawled his own tiny image, a boy holding a bird. A story no decree could erase. The next morning, the guests arrived. Ambassadors from Kush, advisors from the Delta. Even a royal cousin, half-veiled. The mural gleamed in the lamplight. The blue is richer than I remember, one visitor said. A symbol of divine loyalty, Kay replied. The high priest spoke slowly, choosing his words as if shaping them in stone. This wall tells the truth of our people, of our harmony, of order. Setanuk stood still, fingers clenched behind his robe. He had painted that blue with aching hands, knowing the loyalty it depicted was only demanded, never earned. The guests clapped. The wall passed. That evening, the workers were dismissed. No celebrations, no reward. Just silence. Setanuk returned to his corner and packed his brushes. Meru lingered beside him, dragging his hand across the wall one last time. Feels like leaving a grave behind. Setanuk didn't answer, but as they left the temple, he paused. Just before the outer gate, he turned, looked back and smiled. Because even if the wall had been blessed by priests and praised by foreigners, its truth was still there. Carved deep. It would wait. Setanuk stepped away from the temple with only a satchel and the dust of paint still beneath his nails. The streets of Mennefer teemed with festival noise, but for him there was no celebration. His body ached. Not from labor, he was used to that, but from silence. From the weight of all they couldn't say. Meru had already gone, returning to the quarries near Yunu. Nephra stayed behind, having secured quiet work copying hymns at a smaller shrine. Petros was sent to relatives in a quieter village upriver, and Setanak, he went home. Home was not far. A low village along the canals of the Fayum, a place of cracked walls and tall reeds, of old men playing senet under fig trees and goats wandering into courtyards. He hadn't seen it in 3 years. His mother's door creaked the same way. The olive tree out front still bore fruit. She was thinner now, slower to stand, but her eyes still carried the weight of storms. "You look older," she said, brushing dust from his shoulder. "I am." She poured him warm beer and set out lentils without asking why he had come or what he had seen. They didn't speak of the city, not the wall, not the names, not the quiet fear. Only after the second night, as they shared bread near the fire, did she ask, "Did you do the work well?" He nodded. "I did." "And did you speak the truth even if your voice trembled?" Setanak looked at her then. "I did not speak it aloud," he said, "but I carved it." She only nodded. "Then it will remain." In the days that followed, Setanak returned to old rhythms. He repaired baskets, helped the fishermen patch nets, taught a few of the younger boys to measure stones with chalk and string. He avoided the questions, but the questions found him anyway. A man named Kebi, once a scribe who had left the capital in disgrace, approached him at the market. I heard he said quietly, "The mural, it's different." Sednak didn't answer. Kebi nodded. Sometimes silence tells more than a song. Later others came too. Farmers, tradesmen asking about the city, the wall, the truth. He answered carefully, not with details but with feeling. And in this cautious way, stories spread. One night, after helping bury an elder lost to illness, Setanak sat alone beneath the stars. He thought of the wall, the painted priests, the names in the reeds. He wondered how long the paint would last. 10 years, 50. But he knew stone kept secrets longer than kings. And maybe someday someone would find them. A curious boy, a tired worker, a grieving mother, and in the crevice of a carved reed, see a name they did not expect, and wonder. The next morning, he went to the schoolhouse, a one-room space where boys learned math and girls practiced weaving. He brought with him a piece of sandstone and a blank sheet of papyrus. "I want to teach," he told the elder. The man blinked. What not just how to paint Setanak said, how to see, how to remember. The elder studied him for a long moment, then gestured inside. Setanak stepped forward, and as the sun climbed over the reeds, he began again, not with a brush, but with a story. The children sat on woven mats, fidgeting with scraps of reed and clay, while Setanak prepared the lesson. Some of them were sons of farmers, others daughters of potters or fishermen. All of them bore the sun on their skin and the Nile in their eyes. "What do you see when you walk past the canal?" he asked. A bird cried one. A snake said another, grinning. Mud murmured a third with dry honesty. He smiled. "Yes, but what about the reeds?" The whisper, a girl said. Her name was Yari. She was small and clever, always watching. Sometimes they looked like people. Setanak knelt and scratched a line on the sandstone slab, a single reed swaying. In the city, he began carefully. "I once carved reeds on a wall, but they weren't just reeds. Inside them, I hid names." The room grew still. Why, someone whispered. Because the names didn't belong where they were supposed to. The temple wanted to forget them, but I didn't. That afternoon, after class, Yari followed him to the river's edge. She pointed to the real reeds swaying in the breeze. "Were they like these?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like these." She crouched, inspecting them, fingers brushing their bases. Could someone carve into them? Setanak laughed softly. "Only in stone, not in the living ones. But it's the same idea, isn't it?" she asked, eyes wide. "You leave something behind, quietly, but it stays." He looked at her, surprised. "It stays," he repeated. In the following weeks, children began to bring him drawings. not just of birds and sunboats, but of reeds. Inside them, they placed names, their grandparents, their neighbors, even the donkey that hauled grain. The lesson had spread farther than he expected. One boy carved a reed onto a clay pot and gave it to his mother, saying, "Now your name won't be forgotten." Another girl hid a drawing under the school mat, "For someone to find when we're all gone," she said. Setanak didn't correct them. In a world where kings built pyramids, to outlast time, these small acts of remembrance were louder than any trumpet. One morning, a stranger arrived in the village. He wore the robes of a temple scribe, but his hair was too long and his hands too clean. He sought Setanak. "They say you taught the children to write names where they don't belong," the man said. Setanak met his gaze calmly. "I told them to remember. That's not what the scribes in Menepher say." Setanak stepped aside and gestured to the schoolhouse. "Then go ask the children." The man didn't go in. Instead, he walked away, disappearing into the reeds like a jackal at dusk. But his visit left an unease behind. Parents whispered. The elder who'd welcomed Setanak now looked at him with wary eyes. That night, Setanak walked to the edge of the canal and crouched beside the reeds. The breeze made them hum. He took a bit of charcoal and pressed it to a flat stone near the water. A single name, hidden again, not for defiance, but for memory. In the morning, a papyrus scroll was left on his doorstep. It bore no seal, but the script was formal and crisp. It read, "You are not forgotten. The wall stands still. The names remain. So do their meanings. Be cautious, but be proud." No signature. Only a single reed drawn at the bottom. The scroll sat on his shelf between two chipped jars of ochre ink. He hadn't touched it again since that first reading. Setanak often stared at it before lessons began, wondering who had sent it. The handwriting was too practiced for a common scribe, yet too raw to belong to one of the elite script houses in Menepher. Whoever it was, they knew. They had seen the hidden carvings, the buried names. They had cared enough to write. Still in the village, whispers grew. 2 days later, the elder summoned him. "You've drawn attention," the man said, without anger, but with a firmness that left no room for protest. "People speak of you. They wonder why the children write so much about the dead." Setanak folded his hands. "Because the dead are part of the living. We teach them about the harvest, the stars, the weight of stones." "Why not memory?" the elder sighed. "Because memory frightens people, especially when it cannot be controlled." That night, Setanak went to the old well and sat beside it. In the stone rim where no one looked, he pressed a soft reed into wet clay and etched a new line. A single swirl, an idea wrapped in silence. Next morning, Yari didn't come to class, nor did 2 other children. Later, a neighbor's wife stopped by to whisper. Their families worry about the scribes, about being watched. Setanak nodded. He understood, but he felt the heat of something ancient rising again, like when he'd watched those first forbidden names being chiseled from temple walls years ago. This time, he wasn't chiseling them back alone. At dusk, he visited the fisherman by the eastern bank, a quiet man named Hechem, who once painted boats in Thebes. Without speaking, Setanak handed him a folded piece of papyrus. No words, only symbols, a record of what he had been teaching, the names remembered by the children, the idea of memory hidden in ordinary things. "If anything happens," Setanak said, "quietly burn it, or copy it and pass it on. Not for me, for them." Hechem nodded, and that was all. The next market day, the stranger returned, this time with 2 others in similar robes. They watched from a distance, pretending to browse clay pots and grain baskets. Setanak went on teaching, but his tone shifted. Now the lessons came in parable about a stone that kept warmth even after being thrown into the river, or a path that disappeared under dust but returned with every step made in faith. The children listened harder. They understood without needing the words explained. That night, as the village settled into sleep, Setanak lit a single oil lamp and unrolled a fresh sheet of papyrus. He began copying the drawings his students had made reeds and names, birds with symbols hidden in their wingstones with tiny dots that mapped families. It was no longer just a record. It was a seed. He knew this village might not always welcome him. He knew the eyes from Mennefer might return, but someone else someday might find this scroll, might wonder who these names were, why a teacher had hidden so many lives in lines and shadows. They might remember, and in that remembering, the dead would rise not with superstition, but with meaning. The desert was louder than the city. Setanak had forgotten that. When he walked beyond the last acacia trees past the shallow irrigation channels and sun-bleached stones, the silence struck him like a drum. Cicadas rasped from their hiding places. Sand shifted with memory, and above all, the air itself pulsed with the kind of quiet that only those who listen can hear. He had not walked this way in years, not since his brother's funeral. The small shrine lay half-buried beneath a collapsed wall of dried brick. Long ago it had held an idol, its face now eroded, its pedestal cracked by time. But the offering basin remained, and someone had left salt in it, carefully poured, unspoiled. Setanak knelt. He reached into his satchel and drew out a single reed scroll tied with a strip of linen. The drawings inside were crude children's hands, uncertain lines but full of precision. Each line a memory, a person, some living, many gone. He laid the scroll inside the empty basin and poured salt over it, not to hide it, but to preserve, because salt remembered what water tried to erase. When he returned to the village, the officials had already arrived. 3 men in city robes. One bore a seal with the glyph of Mennefer's record hall. Another wore a band across his shoulder, the kind that marked him as one who reported to temples. And the third, silent, stern, eyes that weighed without blinking. "We have questions," the lead scribe said, "about your teaching, about your students." Setanak folded his hands. "I teach writing, numbers, history." The scribe smiled. "And names are part of history, not the ones you've been teaching." They didn't arrest him, not openly, but they made him come to the granary where grain counters doubled as informants. They asked him to recount his entire curriculum, the scrolls he used, the drawings made, the families mentioned. Setanak gave them only what they already knew, and no more. When the third official leaned in and whispered, "There are punishments for preserving what has been erased," Setanak met his gaze and replied softly, "There are greater punishments for forgetting." That evening, the children returned, quietly, one by one. Yari brought his slate. A small girl named Nahiri clutched a reed brush like a talisman. No one spoke of what had happened. They simply resumed their places on the packed earth floor. Setanak changed nothing. He did not flinch. He did not adjust his voice. But as he taught them to draw the glyph for tree, he spoke of one that grew in dry places, whose roots found water others forgot. The children understood. They always did. A week passed, then 2. The strangers left. No charges, no warnings. But their absence felt like a shadow with its eyes still open. And then one night, an old woman knocked on Setanak's door. She wore linen dyed deep brown. Her hair was braided in the old way, worn before the reforms. Her hands trembled as she held out a wrapped bundle. Inside a fragment of wall, from a tomb, a single name still legible despite its age. "They tried to bury this," she whispered, "but I remembered where it was." Setanak cradled the fragment as one would a child. "What was his story?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied, "but I want you to." The next morning, the lesson began with stone. Setanak placed the fragment on the center mat. The children leaned close. He pointed to the glyphs, rough but defiant. "Whoever this was," he said, "lived once, walked the earth, breathed the same dust. Maybe he was a builder, a father, a worker in the fields. We don't know," he paused, "but we can remember him." They wrote the name on their slates, carefully tracing each stroke. And in that act, an unnamed life returned, if only for a moment, in chalk and dust and breath. Rain was rare in the village. When it came, it didn't fall so much as whisper, barely touching the skin before vanishing. But this morning, as Setanak rose to sweep the classroom floor, he saw thin streaks darkening the mud brick walls, a blessing disguised as shadow. The children arrived in cloaks and giggles, their sandals coated with wet earth. A change in weather always shifted the air, made things feel possible. Setanak opened the shutters wider, let the scent of wet papyrus drift in, and began the lesson. Today they wrote without instruction. Each child chose a name, someone from the village, a relative, a person they'd heard of but never met, and beside the name they drew something small, a jar, a fruit tree, a broken tool, things that said more than dates or titles ever could. Setanak didn't speak much. He simply moved among them, gently correcting a curve here, a misplaced stroke there. When he returned to his seat, a folded reed paper waited on his table. He opened it. Inside a single word, they watched. That afternoon, he found the mark, near the well, carved low into the plaster where water pots usually rested. A standard glyph, but stylized, meant only for those who knew what to look for. It was a warning. He'd seen it once years ago during the reforms in Kemwi's district, when a scroll keeper had been taken away in daylight for writing a name meant to be forgotten. After that, the villagers began using symbols, not to speak louder, but to stay alive. Setanak brushed his fingers over the mark, then covered it with a smear of fresh mud. Even warnings needed hiding sometimes. He went to the old potter that night. The man's hands shook from age but remained precise. When Setanak made his request, the potter didn't ask why. He simply nodded and pulled out a flattened coil of clay. "This one will crack in fire," he said. "Good for hiding." By moonlight, Setanak etched the glyphs into the pot's underside. Names places a sentence from a song once sung at a wedding no one remembered. He pressed his seal into the rim, then buried it in the potter's kiln under others meant for market. "They'll fire tomorrow," the potter said. "You can come just before dawn." Setanak bowed. Not a thank you, a vow. The officials returned the next day. They didn't question this time, only watched. Two leaned against the old granary wall, pretending to inspect the harvest tallies. Another spoke softly with a scribe from the temple. Setanak taught as usual, but his voice was a little firmer. He chose a simple glyph bridge, a word that had many meanings: crossing, connection, passage. The children repeated it, wrote it, then one by one added lines that weren't in the textbook. A reed raft, a mother's hand, a broken chain. None of them said what they meant, but Setanak understood. Later that week, he returned to the kiln. The pot had survived the firing. Its underside bore the faintest inscriptions disguised among decorative grooves. The clay had warped slightly, giving the pot an uneven wobble. No one would choose it. No one would use it. It was perfect. He traded 2 measures of barley for it, then took it home. He didn't hide it, didn't bury it. He placed it on a low shelf just beside the oil lamp where light could strike the grooves at evening. So it could be read, so it could be remembered. The dust had its own rhythm. It collected in corners no broom could reach. It softened the edges of tabletops and door frames. It settled in folds of cloth and the grooves of stone, dulling everything except memory. Setanak had learned to live with it, to read what it preserved. Dust to him was not filth, it was evidence. So when he opened his mother's old chest that morning, the thin coat of dust inside didn't prompt a sneeze, it prompted silence and reverence. Inside were no great treasures. A torn linen sash, a sun-bleached scrap of him, a shard of pottery with a fingerprint still visible. The smell of myrrh, faint but stubborn. He remembered her hands, not the softness, but the way she handled tools, how she used her thumb to press clay into the mold just so, how she sealed food jars with a twist of reed fiber and quiet determination. And when he found the tiny figurine no longer than his palm shaped like a fish, he knew she'd made it, not for the market, not for offering, but for him. Later that day, Setanak told the children to write stories, but only using objects. No names, he said. No people, only things. They stared at him, puzzled. How can we tell a story without someone in it, one asked. People disappear, he replied softly. Objects remember. They didn't fully understand, but they tried. And when the girl named Hekeni laid her reed stylus down, she handed him her sheet without looking. 3 objects: a comb, a cracked seal, a broken wheel. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply placed it on the shelf beside his mother's fish. That evening, the village held a quiet gathering. No festival, no holiday, just the kind of unspoken meeting that happens when people feel something shifting beneath their feet. The elders murmured about missing scrolls. A farmer claimed 2 jars were marked and then replaced in his shed. Another had noticed footprints by his granary small bear, deliberate. Setanak listened more than he spoke. When asked, he only said, "Dust tells us where someone stood, even when they're gone." It wasn't much, but they nodded. Sometimes truth is not shouted. It's brushed gently across silence. The following morning, Setanak woke to a gift on his doorstep. A single date palm branch tied with thread. To most meaningless, but he knew the thread's weave. A woman named Yarete used it to seal her grain sacks. She hadn't spoken to him in years, not since the scroll burning when her brother was taken and she stopped singing at the temple. He tucked the branch behind the pot on the shelf. Now the grooves caught more than just firelight. They caught shadow and hint and warning. That afternoon, he scratched a phrase into his lesson slate, small enough to be mistaken for a practice glyph. 1 reed can split stone. Then he erased it, not because it was dangerous, but because it had already done its work. The classroom was unusually quiet that morning. Setanak stood beside the long table, unrolling a brittle scroll. It was not from the temple library. It was older, fragile and faint, with corners that frayed like ash in the breeze. The students gathered closer, sensing its rarity. Today, he said, we study a map. They peered down. There were no names, no compass. Just lines, angular, intersecting, some looping back on themselves. It looked more like a tangle than a path. One of the older boys frowned. "Where's the river?" Setanak smiled thin and tired. There isn't one. The map had been drawn during the reign of a forgotten regent. Not forgotten by time, but by design. His name had been struck from records, his likeness chipped from walls. Yet here in this scroll was his memory. A record of food routes, hidden wells, passageways beneath temple floors, coded in geometry invisible to the eye unless you knew what you were looking for. Maps, Setanak whispered, are not always about where to go. Sometimes they're about what to remember. He let them trace the patterns. Let them feel the weight of knowing that didn't need to speak. Later, he took the map to the archives. Not the official shelves, but the back beneath the clay tiles loose enough to lift without cracking. There, among jars of blank papyrus, he folded the scroll and tucked it behind a false panel. A place only he and one other person knew. Callie. She had once been the temple scribe. Her hands were bent now, fingers stiff from years of ink, but her mind razor sharp. "You've shown them too much," she said when he visited. "I've shown them almost nothing," he replied. "But they're beginning to ask the right questions." Callie grunted. "Then we don't have long." That night, Setanak sat by the courtyard brazier and opened a piece of old linen. The girl Hekeni had given it to him earlier, wrapped around a shard of fired clay. On it, carved in shaky lines, was the looped pattern of the No River map. She had copied it by memory. No stylus, no ink, just her hand and quiet defiance. He didn't praise her. He didn't need to. He placed the shard in a hollow behind a courtyard stone beside 3 others left by different hands. Not a message, a map, not to escape, but to return. The following morning, soldiers marched past the school. They didn't enter, but Setanak knew they would. Soon. The time for quiet had almost passed. He wiped down the table, rolled up the lesson mats, and placed a tiny mark on the door frame one most would mistake as a carpenter's knot. But those who had traced the riverless map would know the tide was shifting. and the current was underground. Her hands were once the fastest in the archive. When the viziers needed a scroll copied in haste, they called Kali. When the high priest whispered an amendment to the sacred laws, she was the one who scratched it into permanence, her fingers smudged with ink, but her eyes catching every misstep. But now her hands trembled, not from age, though she was old, but from knowing too much. Kali sat on a worn mat behind the archive room. The sunlight barely reached her here, only slanting in lines through a crack in the clay wall. She preferred it that way. Too much light invited questions. She unfolded a small pouch. Inside, a reed stylus cut to her old preference, a lump of blackened ink, and a strip of linen, coarse but still writable. She wrote slowly. One line, one truth. They are beginning to see. Another pause. Her fingers flexed, then gripped the stylus again. The names they erase are not forgotten. We carry them even if never spoken aloud. Setanak arrived at midday. He didn't speak at first, just placed a small sealed jar beside her. Honey and barley. She looked up. Feeding me before the storm. No, he said. Feeding the fire. Kali's eyes crinkled at the corners. You always were too poetic for your own safety. I learned from you. She snorted. Then maybe you're doomed. Together, they examined the copied shard the girl Hakeni had drawn. Kali turned it over in her hand, tracing the lines like a blind woman reading secrets. She drew this from memory. She watched one said Setana. No ink, no papyrus, just sand and air. Kali nodded slowly. Then the work is no longer ours alone. She motioned toward a cracked amphora in the corner. Inside were 4 dozen fragments of failed scrolls too fragile to preserve, too dangerous to destroy. I've begun again, she said. In code this time. Rhythms the senses can't read, but the children will. That night, Kali made her slow way to the rooftop. Below, the temple district glowed with the golden illusion of order. Clean lines, unbroken walls, guards walking in pairs. But she remembered the first time the fires rose years ago, when she was young and the regime hadn't yet turned history into a weapon. That rebellion had been crushed, buried, forgotten by decree. But she hadn't forgotten, and neither had her hands. She traced the rim of her palm on the clay tile beside her. A signal. By dawn the pattern would be seen. A handprint, old, scarred, still moving. The clay seal shattered just before dawn. Not with violence, not even with ceremony. It crumbled quietly, damp from the early mist. The brittle edges softened by time. A breeze swept through the narrow alleyway behind the old library, carrying with it a slip of linen, no longer bound in secrecy. And with it words, names, dates, events never spoken aloud in public, yet now fluttering like a leaf caught on the breath of a storm. Setanak watched from the roof of the abandoned granary. He was no longer alone. By his side were those who had once kept their heads low, the baker's son with soot still under his nails, the blind potter who heard too much for her own good, even Messi, the watchman, whose father had disappeared after questioning a tax scroll. None of them held weapons. What they held was memory, and now evidence. Kali's encoded parchments had reached the river villages. Children repeated chants that rhymed oddly with censored temple texts. The chants made no direct accusations, but if you listened closely, if you knew the names, the timelines, they told everything. One girl drew a bird with one wing folded. Another marked a sun with no rays. Both symbols from stories erased 3 dynasties ago. But someone had remembered. And someone had shared. The magistrate's hall that morning received 7 identical notes, each written in the same childlike scrawl, each with the phrase, "Who stole the year the stars went black?" It meant nothing to the untrained eye. But Setanak knew. It referred to the Great Eclipse, a celestial event blamed for famine, but which, according to the forbidden scrolls, had been manipulated to cover a mass relocation of dissenting scribes from the north. His grandfather had been among them. Now children were asking questions the regime never wanted asked. A week earlier, they had been cautious. Now they were deliberate, not reckless, but measured. Every fragment of truth copied in triplicate. Every chant passed orally, then written in invisible ink made from lotus root. Every person told had to pass a test not of loyalty, but of remembrance. If you can't remember what was lost, Kali had said, you can't be trusted to preserve what remains. By midday, guards arrived at the pottery district. They were searching for documents of subversion. Instead, they found 20 broken jars. Inside each dust, fine, grey, useless, or so they thought. But under firelight, that dust would reveal faint impressions, texts burned from memory preserved in negative space. The regime had never considered memory a weapon, but it was, and now the seal was broken. In the southern quarter, a low melody began. A tune hummed by an old woman as she swept her stoop. A tune that hadn't been heard in 70 years. Those who knew the lyrics said nothing. They only nodded and listened. And remembered. They called him the Ink Eater. Officially, he was Inspector Karem. A tall man with wrist too thin for his uniform cuffs and a way of reading scrolls like he was tasting poison. He had arrived in the city not a week prior sent. It was whispered not just to find dissenters but to erase them from record. Setanach had seen him once years ago, back when the older scribe still muttered names in code. The inspector had walked into the city archives and walked out with 2 trunks and no receipts. The names of 5 families vanished after that. Now he was back. That morning, a quiet tremble passed through the civil quarter. Not fear, something older, like the memory of a drought that once dried the wells. No drum sounded, no fanfare, just a sudden tightening of every hand that held a pen. Every tongue that had dared to hum the wrong tune, every elder who remembered their teacher disappearing in the spring of year 19. The inspector's sandal steps echoed louder than a parade. He went first to the record house. There he sat for 3 hours, reading not current entries, but edits, erasures, corrections, margin notes. He flagged every scroll that looked too perfect, then demanded access to the backup stacks. It was there he found one of Setanach's early copies, a tablet misaligned, a word scratched faintly in a different hand, a date that didn't match the official logs. Who was your scribe here? No name listed, sir. It was a volunteer copy. A lie, but an old one. Practiced, smooth. He didn't press. Instead, he marked the shelf with a ribbon. Read, then left. Setanach watched from behind the lattice above the hallway. He knew that ribbon. It meant review for destruction. Not just of the scroll, but of anyone tied to it. He exhaled slowly, then descended the stairwell into the cellar, where Kali waited beside the fire basin. The Ink Eater found shelf 4. Kali didn't flinch. She looked instead to the table, where 3 apprentices silently copied from memory the chants carried in song across the river. Then we're ahead of schedule, she whispered. At dusk, Inspector Karam visited the potter's house. By morning, the old kiln had collapsed. Neighbors claimed it was an accident, but the fire had been precise, controlled. Only the western wall and a single room burned. That room had once held hundreds of clay tablets. Now only scorched shelves remained. Despite the fear, the city did not fall silent. If anything, it hummed louder underneath. Scratchings behind shutters, footsteps timed with sand carriers to mask the rhythm, and in the temple district someone began carving an old story onto the back of a statue. A tale of a scribe who once wrote truth into wet clay, so deeply that even the gods couldn't erase it. The statue was of a bird with 1 wing, the same symbol the inspector had once confiscated from the northern city archives. Setanach no longer carried documents. He carried rhythm, a foot tap here, a head nod there. The network didn't speak in words now. It moved in gesture, pattern, silence, and the inspector, for all his cleverness, could not silence what he could not hear. That night, the inspector sat alone writing in a ledger with no cover. The candle flickered its flame, casting shadows against the reed walls. He paused, tapped his stylus, glanced at the empty shelves, then sighed, and added one word beneath the day's entry: memory uncooperative. Next morning, the city awoke to the sound of stone shifting. Not the usual grind of carts or distant chisels, but something deeper, older. The Temple of Correct, closed for nearly 2 decades, had opened its southern gate. No announcement, no priest in attendance, just a guardless arch yawning into a courtyard no one had stepped into since the season of withering. Setanak arrived mid-morning, scroll bundle tucked under his arm, a dull reed stylus hidden in his sash. He wasn't the only one drawn by the silence. A group of traders paused at the steps. 2 elders whispered prayers they hadn't spoken aloud in years. A child placed a pebble at the base of the gate, then backed away, eyes wide, as if she'd woken a god. But there were no gods here, only walls, and inside those walls, a chance. Callie was waiting within. She wore no head wrap, no official robe, just a plain linen tunic and a strip of dark cloth tied at her wrist, the old sign of a vow not yet fulfilled. "You came," she said. "The gate was open," he replied. "I didn't ask who opened it." She gave a small nod, and they walked side by side beneath the shadowed columns. Each footstep sent dust curling across forgotten tiles. At the rear of the temple, a ladder now led down into a passage that hadn't been charted on any recent map. "It survived the fire?" Setanak asked. Callie smiled, tired but certain. "Not fire. Neglect. Worse," he said quietly. They descended. The air changed. Cooler. Drier. The smell of limestone and old ink. Here, beneath the city's spiritual spine, were stacks upon stacks of uncharted records. Tablets without signature. Scrolls half encoded. Documents that had no political value until the present regime deemed them dangerous. Setanak's fingers ran across a tablet engraved with agricultural tallies from the 12th dynasty, but tucked behind it was a thinner piece scratched on both sides, its etchings rhythmic like verse. The old teaching stories, Callie whispered, from before the Red Reform, from before anyone feared being remembered. For the next 3 hours they worked in silence, cataloguing not by ruler or god, but by voice. Who had written it, who had copied it, whose margin notes revealed doubt. It was a map of people, not power, and as they sifted through the knowledge, a picture formed. That truth was never centralized. It was scattered, and survival meant knowing how to gather the shards again. Above them, the city swirled in uncertainty. The inspector had issued new scroll checks. Scribes were to present their latest transcriptions by dusk or risk formal inquiry. Setanak knew what that meant. Callie handed him a sealed clay envelope. "Deliver this to the city granary, to Merit, no one else." He nodded. "And you, I'll stay. Someone must guard the gate now that it's open. You think they'll come? Not yet. But someone will. Someone always does." She turned to face the far wall. There, inscribed in ancient paint, was a phrase neither of them had read aloud in years. "If they bury the sun, right in moonlight." As Setanak climbed back into the morning light, he passed 2 temple guards, slowly approaching the courtyard. They looked uneasy, like men who had forgotten whether they served a temple or a throne. He kept walking. No eye contact. Only the memory of what lay beneath Dusty, real and too vital to forget. That afternoon, 5 scribes failed to submit their scrolls. 2 of them were detained. The rest vanished. But the inspector's records remained incomplete. He noted the absences, scratched the names into his private ledger, and muttered, "Ink eats ink." But fire leaves shape. Setanak arrived at the city granary before sunset. The queue of workers stretched into the courtyard, men and women, waiting to register this season's final shipments of barley flax and lentils. Dust clung to their arms and fatigue etched deep lines into their faces. "Name," the record keeper asked. Setanak stepped forward, presenting the clay-sealed note. "For Merit, directly." The man scowled. "Merit is tallying stores. You'll wait. But a voice cut through the air before Setenak could argue. Let him pass, Merit, wrapped in the same indigo shawl she'd worn since her son was conscripted. Merit was both feared and trusted a woman who could recall grain weights from 3 seasons ago and the name of every scribe who ever misplaced a shipment. She took the seal without looking at it. Follow me. Inside the narrow stone chamber behind the tally hall, away from carts and counting boards, Merit set the clay down and broke it open. Unfolding the papyrus, she read once, then again slower. She's opening the ledger, Merit finally asked. Setenak nodded, carefully, quietly, and the inspector, already watching too many others. Merit tapped the note on the table. We'll need copies. If the originals are found, they'll burn them. They might burn us. She looked up, eyes sharp. Then copy quickly. She reached under the table, lifting a wrapped bundle of old inkstones and sharpened reeds. You remember how to write in merchant shorthand? Setenak smiled faintly. Better than I remember my own mother's voice. For the next hour they worked under flickering torchlight. Setenak transcribed the hidden scrolls Callie had sent, phrases and fragments teaching fables poems lost in reform. Merit annotated the margins in code only traders used weight marks, disguised as metaphors, price symbols masked as years. By the time the torch burned low, they had 6 new copies, each written to look like mundane cargo manifests. These go out with the lentil shipments tomorrow, she said, tying them into woven bundles. Northbound 1 to Abdu, 2 for the river towns. 1 stays here in the silo. The rest, scatter them. Let them breathe. Setenak nodded. But before leaving, he asked the question that had been rising in his chest all day. Do you believe it matters that anyone will read these? Merit didn't answer at first. She lifted a small leather pouch from under the table and opened it. Inside was a folded parchment, aged, cracked, barely legible. She handed it to him. A child's handwriting, spidery hopeful. A prayer to Osiris thanking the Nile for coming on time. Signed to the future. I found this hidden inside a barley jar. 24 years ago, Merit said. No name. Just the idea that someone might find it. And you did, so I kept it. If a child thought it was worth writing, I decided it was worth saving. She gave him the pouch. And yours. At night, Setenak walked home through alleys lined with empty pots and fading murals. He clutched the pouch like a second heart. The city was changing. Not fast, not loud, but it was. Not because banners rose or palaces fell, but because ink did not stop. Because memory moved even when buried beneath ledgers and lentils. The next morning, a column of smoke rose above the southern docks. Not thick, not violent, just steady. Setenak saw it from the temple steps where he had come to deliver chalk slates for the junior scribes. His stomach tightened. Smoke like that rarely meant fire. It meant a message. He quickened his pace. By mid-morning, whispers filled the market. Another shipment burned. They say someone found writings hidden in grain sacks. Inspection is doubling at the granaries. No shipments north today. Setenak ducked into a weaver's stall and waited until the crowd thinned. The smoke still trailed across the sky, an omen or a warning, or perhaps both. He didn't need to ask which shipment it had been. By midday, he was back at the granary. Merit was already outside. She didn't look surprised, just tired. They burned the sacks bound for Abdu, she said, without turning. Someone tipped the overseers, or the bundles were marked, the copies gone. Setenak clenched his hands. I'll make more. You'll be watched. Then I'll be careful. Merit finally looked at him. Care won't matter if they change the rules. You know what happens when they stop pretending to be fair. That evening, Setenak sat beside the river with a slate in his lap. He traced lines, not words, not yet, just lines. A dry wind swept over the reeds. He thought of the old child's prayer Merit had shown him. The faith that someone someday would read a simple message and understand its weight. Setenak didn't know if what they were doing could change the city, but he knew this the fire had not reached the silo. Not all copies were lost, and more importantly, the idea remained. They had seen smoke, but no names were spoken. No one arrested, No home searched. Not yet. This wasn't a defeat. It was a signal. Someone noticed. And that meant someone had read. As the moon rose, Setanak returned home. He lit a lamp and opened the reed bundle that Callie had sent last week. Inside, pressed between scrolls, was a strip of linen wrapped around a broken stylus. He unwrapped it slowly. A new message. Burn the stylus, not the words. The ones who watched Abdul are moving west. Continue in code. Use pigment markers. They won't read inkless script. We are still here. Setnak let out a slow breath. Not all messages survive, but some do, and that sometimes is enough to keep going. Setnak walked into the quarry before dawn, not as a scribe, not as a messenger, but as one of the labourers. His linen robes had been swapped for a rough kilt. His hands bore no reed pens, just an empty basket, and the quiet determination of a man blending in. Callie had arranged it. No names, no questions, just access, because the next phase required stone. Inside the quarry, hundreds of men chipped and hauled and shouted above the clamour. Each block of limestone cut, weighed and catalogued by overseers. But not every block was meant for a monument. Setanak moved carefully. He stayed near a broken corner where rejects were piled stones, too chipped, too flawed to be carved for temples, perfect for his purpose. He waited until the third hour when the overseer stepped away to argue over delivery weights. Then, with practiced hands, he knelt beside one stone and reached into his basket. Out came a chisel, not for carving, but for etching. The message was short, meant to be buried. We were not blind. We remembered. We resisted. 3 lines, deep enough to survive years, small enough to be mistaken for worker graffiti. He copied the same message onto 5 stones over 2 days. Each was then slid among the discard piles meant to be reused someday by builders or scholars or children playing among ruins. It didn't matter when. What mattered was that it existed. On the 3rd night, Callie returned from the western outpost. She was sunburned thin, but smiling. Abdu's temple was searched. The priest burned ledgers, but didn't find the encoded scrolls. How they were etched into the wall plaster, under the frieze. We trained the children to read them out loud in the old prayers. The guards never listened. Setanak laughed quietly, bitterly with awe. They turned hymns into history. Isn't that what they always were? He looked at her, really looked. There was pride in her and pain. The years had stolen much, but not her will. Do you think we'll ever write freely? I think she said that someday someone will read your stone and wonder who you were, and they'll know enough to ask more questions. That's not freedom. No, she admitted, but it's a start. The next morning, the smoke was gone. The granaries were quiet. The overseers suspicious but tired. The city for now turned back to routine. But underground, in ledgers, in forgotten corners of temples, in stones too flawed to worship a truth remained. Small, etched, carried, and waiting. Because the war was not over. But for the first time in many years, Setanak allowed himself this dangerous thought. Perhaps the future will know we tried.